Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your time today. So let's start. Can everyone see my screen now?
Looks good to me.
Perfect. Let's begin. And to start, we'll present ourselves. So Restless, go ahead and present yourself.
Hey, I am Restless Nomad. I'm not along with a number of other names, but that's the one everyone will know me by. I was at MetaFilter from, I really typoed that, didn't I? 2011 to 2021. I was a moderator until 2020, took a brief break, and then came back and ran operations for about 9 months. I have been doing online community management since I was about 20 years old, worked in the game industry, worked in the music business, and I have done a lot of really random things that often inform my moderation.
And now to present myself, so I am Lou, as you know me. Actually, I just realized there's a typo there because I've been here since 2020 as well. And
what is time?
Yeah, I mean, moreover with the pandemic, right? You no longer know what time it is.
Not the faintest.
Yeah. And since all the changes in the site, I've been leading the moderation team and site operations since June this year. And I've been working with mostly with startups, but around the world with different organizations with trust and safety, site policy, community building and moderation since it's been like, what, 12 years? Something like that. And so today we want to give you an overview of how moderation has worked historically, what we've been doing, how things have changed, and we're going to cover a little bit of that, and then we'll open it for questions. So, Restless, do you want to start with the background on how things used to be, and we'll take it from there?
Sure. Okay, so this is a very helpful bullet list, but to sum up sort of big picture, the moderation on MetaFilter is largely reactive. We respond to emails, we check on flags, we keep an eye on threads that look like they might need moderation, and sometimes we can step in before the community alerts us to things, but mostly we are letting the community guide our attention. We also, the hierarchy has always been very flat. So there aren't, a lot of places have moderators, and then they have like middle management or policy people or some other tier. We all did all of that pretty much. We did the policy, we maintained the FAQ, we all handled basically all levels of moderation concerns. The only real difference was what shift we were working. And yeah, we banned people.
When necessary.
That was sometimes the fun part.
Yeah, historically, I would say things have changed in several ways, particularly kind of what has been over time has been originally, it used to be very, everyone gets to wear every single hat. Because pretty much the entire team was just Frimble and moderators, right? So it meant that we all get to do pretty much everything. And one of the things that I realized is that in terms of workload and communication wasn't very stable. So we have started distributing a little bit more who does what. So when it comes to checking on reports and responding to inquiries and stuff like that, it's pretty much everyone. Same as deciding policy, because diversity actually helps us take the best decisions, right? If I make a decision myself alone, it's not going to be as good as if I can actually peer review it with the rest of the team. That being said, on other things, who does what in more operational things has changed. So before it was pretty much anything that was operations related was either Restless Nomad or Cortex back then. Now it's a little bit spread. So we have time taking care of most of the coordination with the BIPOC board. then myself doing most of the operational part. Then we have Taz taking care of most of the things that are content related, like keeping updated, best of MetaFilter and social media, including Twitter and stuff like that. And I would say another big thing is also how we handle meta talk has changed over time as well, which before used to be like the first thing you would do as soon as you check in would be stay on top of every single thread that is in there. Now it's more like, for example, I do take care of the site updates, where on those we go over the things that are happening. Another thing that you haven't seen much of that yet, but it's a sneak peek of what is coming, is if we're planning to implement any changes, be it in policy or in how something in the site works, we'll create a thread for that. But generally, one of the approaches we've been trying is more like having one person dedicated to that rather than the entire team, which is better for the sake of continuity. So I think those are the main changes. Of course, we used to have around the clock moderation. Right now, the way it works is we have almost around the clock moderation. And in the small gaps that we do have some tools that allow us to see if something important is going on. So I can step in the gaps during the daytime in the US. And then for the European times, we have other people who do that. And that's pretty much on the things that we have in here. One of the important things that I want to call out is a lot of the work, because it's not only what members flag as inappropriate within the site, right? But then there are a lot of actions that are taken in the background. So for example, one of the things that we tend to do all the time is it's not only what the comments are and how we consider any of that inappropriate or not, but also who is it coming from. And what I mean by that is we do track behavior, right? Behavior is important because sometimes you get to see that content might not be as abusive itself, but then you start identifying trends, right? And we want to catch those before they become a problem.
Yeah, that is not new, but that is very well said.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I can say there for sure is that historically that has been quite accurate. So for example, and this actually, it's a perfect introduction to the next slide. But we will not go into details of who it was or what it happened or stuff like that. But there were a few comments recently where I was like, well, this comes across as a little transphobic. And immediately we banned that person. When that person contacted us, like, why was I banned? I mentioned the reasons why, and immediately the answers were actually very transphobic, to the point where I was like, well, not only this was a good call, but it's good that this is exploding in a way that it's not in front of the community, which is exactly part of what we want to do. We want to make sure that the space remains clean of that kind of things.
Yeah, that is actually, that has been an evolution. When I came on in 2011, previously it had been Josh and Matt and Jessamine working 24/7. Like basically all three of them were on call all the time. And so whenever somebody happened to see a flag, that was when they dealt with it. And that was not a good work setup for a variety of reasons, and had been increasingly not working, which is why things changed when they brought me on. But also Matt in particular had been really reluctant to ban people. Really wanted to give second chances and third chances and fifth chances. And one of the changes that happened, it was either right before or right after I came on, is we added a tool on the back end to add notes, freeform notes for us, so that, you know, we'd always tracked what got flagged, what got deleted. That makes sense to track, but we now could say, hey, we had a conversation with this guy and this went this way, and we should be keeping an eye on this in the future. And that made it immensely easier to track those patterns. And then when Matt left and Josh took over and our staffing size went down, one of the very first things we did is said, okay, you might be able to get a second chance, but you're not getting a 17th chance. And some of y'all are on your 17th chance. And I think that really made a big difference in some of that low level maybe no one incident is really terrible, but there's definitely a pattern of racist or transphobic or sexist or just gross behavior.
On that, I think it's also important to cover one thing that to me is super important, which is sometimes a lot of the reports we get, I mean, there are things that are obvious violations that are not okay. Against transphobia, xenophobia, stuff like that, it's not gonna happen, right? We'll delete you, we'll ban you, that will be deleted. On other cases, I mean, there are behavioral things like when you decide to pick fights for specific subjects all the time and not being super nice. And on those, part of the thing that we do, and I think that is super important, is, again, because diversity of thought helps a lot here, is we'll generally discuss the subject together, right? To make decisions on what's the best way to proceed. Sometimes, you know, can be like, we'll warn that person privately or ban them temporarily. But how we take it from there, it's going to be an open conversation that not every case is the same, right? So it's very adapted to what's the situation going and how things have been historical. And that actually leads me to the other important thing, which is what are the things we don't do? Because, for example, when it comes to moderation policy and the things we do, where, well, we can talk openly about the things that happen. It's super important to call out that we will never disclose any private or personally identified information. On top of that, for example, if you happen to report someone or something that happens, your report as well is private, right? We do not disclose who is reporting anything or anything like that. And as in the cases I have been mentioning, we will not go over the specific details of who it was or any of that. So privacy is super important, as covered in the privacy policy, and we'll go over that as well. And then we will not republish or discuss in public any details of our communications with other members, exactly for the same reason as we value privacy.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
That has been historically a little bit tricky when people have republished our communications, often in part. And then we're sort of put in the position of being like, well, you left out the middle 3 emails of that chain. And so we kind of look like loons. And that's a difficult position to be put in. And I think we have made a variety of choices over the years that mostly came down to, well, we can handle looking like loons if we know we did the right thing. We're still not going to publish somebody's emails if we can possibly avoid it. We may mention that there were other emails. We may talk about, you know, the policy decision and the details of the situation. That is one thing that has changed in MetaTalk. We used to get way more into it about specific people. The call out thread situation. You think Twitter is bad. Man, MetaFilter was doing that before it was cool. And I'm really glad that we started pushing back and enabling the queue actually really shut that off. People just, they didn't want to have to get permission to yell at somebody on the internet, I think is the thing. And those threads were not historically productive. They didn't help. They didn't make things better. And so I think it's generally good that we don't see those anymore.
And it's super important because one of the important things at the end of the day, I mean, what MetaFilter is and how good it is, a lot of that has to do with the community moderators are here actually just to make sure that that happens, right? So for example, when you report something, it's super important. A lot of times something will be reported to us and we might not see everything. So when it comes with a comment saying this specifically, it's not okay because of this. Even sometimes I learn myself of things that I was not aware of. And it's good for me to first learn and apply it from now on. But second, it's an ongoing and a never evolving thing, right? What we think. And same as the time changes. And that also goes into another thing, which is discussing issues with third parties. I think this is super important because sometimes this is when it gets tricky when it comes to communication. So sometimes, yes, we can discuss policy and we can be open about what our policy is and something, but then there are things that we will not disclose, even if that looks bad sometimes. I mean, a couple times it has happened to me, for example, that there is a thread where someone, a member, it's been like particularly fighty with us, the moderators, which is okay. I mean, we can take it. But then, of course, that takes attention to that profile. And then I go and check the profile and I realize that this profile, it's from someone who has been banned several times. Right? So, of course, I can't discuss anything like that. And I will not discuss anything like that. And of course, people can assume terrible intent that that account was deleted because of something like fighting with us. No, actually, it's if something like that happens, we do have clear policies on when something needs to be removed and why. And those clear policies, we have them pretty much covered in here, which are our guidelines, the microaggressions document, the content policy, and the privacy policy. I would say these 4 documents have been a huge milestone because in spirit, they have existed for a long, long time, but how they have been created and curated over the past years have made a difference. Because when it comes to the community guidelines, where what we are talking about is how we want people to behave, right? What it's the things that we want from the community, what we consider it's good behavior. But then you also have things that are microaggressions, that are things that, you know, you can be aggressive and you can overstep a boundary. That's not cool. That's not okay. But it's not necessarily abusive content. I mean, it can be harmful, yes, and we want you to be aware. But how we handle that can be different. In those cases, we might reach out to the members privately and tell them, like, look, this is not cool, right?
Yeah.
And then we have the content policy, which is super clear. This, whenever anything like this happens, like pretty much not only content it's going to be removed, but pretty much your account, right?
Pretty much.
Super obvious things. Yeah. And then, of course, we have, go ahead.
Oh, like name calling, maybe. That might be an overnight ban, but basically everything else on that list, yeah, no.
Yeah. And so I think it's super important, the fact that it's now more clearly defined, like where are the boundaries, what are those things? So it's better to understand that for members and for us. And on top of that, how we enforce them. Because again, sometimes when you report something, you expect the comment to be removed. Actually, you will see recently, one of the things that I've seen from moderation that it's becoming more and more common is saying this particular comment was not okay and it's not being deleted, it's staying there for context so that you know exactly in which context it was said. But that doesn't make it any better.
That has been a long conversation with the community over the years, where those lines are, because it often is like we started at, when I first started, we leaned a little bit against deleting context. If there was a comment that was unpleasant that we normally would delete, but it had been up for 3 hours, which used to happen all the time when we didn't have full 24/7 coverage. And there was a whole thread about it, you know, and it had shaped the conversation. We would just leave it. And we'd say, okay, you know, like we might speak with the user, but we wouldn't delete it because that would make the thread unintelligible. And then there was a lot of pushback for the kinds of things that the content guidelines says we ought to remove, were staying up in a way that was more hurtful than constructive. And so we swung back a little bit more towards deleting more things. And then we got and then, you know, often there would be a comment that got deleted and then had a really good, clear explanation of why that comment wasn't okay from another user, that we would then have to be like, now this has no context and we can delete it, but that's a waste of this user's really excellent work, or we can leave it and leave everybody confused. And so we went back and forth for years on on the balance of that. And I suspect it's never going to be a fixed point of where to make that call.
And I think you are calling something that is super important to me, because I mean, we do have policies. Again, what I was trying to say is, even though something doesn't necessarily get removed, it doesn't mean that we are not taking actions, because there's a whole variety of things that we can do about that. But the other important thing that it's super important to mention is that this is a never evolving thing, right? Because moderation, sometimes I think, and this does not apply to MetaFilter, this applies to content in general, how it's handled with any service or website. And people tend to see them as an authority, right? While I think that for MetaFilter specifically, one of the things that makes it ever evolving is more like, no, yes, we do discuss policy, but what we are trying to enforce and what we are trying to make sure that happens is just that members feel safe, right? So if at some point something is not okay for someone, we are not here to determine if that it's right or not. We are here to listen that someone feels left out or someone feels attacked by this, and this actually matters. So we need to have a clear position on this.
Yeah, and it's tricky because not everything that hurts someone's feelings is an offense. You know, like people can have arguments. They can have arguments and both people can walk away mad, and those arguments can still be well within the bounds of civil discourse. People can have what don't look like arguments that appear to be perfectly civil exchanges that are full of microaggressions and absolutely horrible if you have the context to understand them. And so it is never something, I mean, one of my crusades in general is that you can never moderate by decision tree alone. You can't just have a series of checkboxes saying, well, it's got this word in it and therefore it's deletable, or, you know, this conversation went on for 5 exchanges and therefore it needs to be cut off and anything else is deleted, or anything like that. You really have to be able to understand all of the context of the conversation in order to be able to moderate it.
And on that, I think one particular case that happens I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's super important. Again, I think that's where it's important to look at trends. Sometimes we will not take action, yes, but we are seeing what the behavior is like. One of the things that I have seen, I wouldn't say it's the most common thing, but it's, you know, there's people who can be like, the comments are not necessarily wrong themselves until you realize that there is this common trend of, you know, my question, it's actually, okay, let me just ask a question and I'm going to take your words, twist them in many ways, and I'm going to do that in the fightiest way possible. And okay, once you are like, okay, probably there was a misunderstanding or something, but then you can see trends sometimes.
Oh,
and that's when you decide something needs to be done here, right? Because we want people to feel safe to share what they think, right? Without having to get on a fight that it's totally unnecessary.
And it is possible for user education to work. It is, but there have been users that have been genuine, real problems who, through a lot of conversations on the back end and sometimes on the front end, have changed their behavior and don't do the thing that used to be awful. Some of them are still around. Some of them, you know, are from 10 years ago and they've moved on. It can happen. Sometimes a normally perfectly fine and friendly and constructive user has a bad day or week or a new baby or, you know, some general life trauma, and all of a sudden they're kind of taking it out on everybody. And that's something we can often be like, hey, man, be cool. Like, you know how to be cool. We know you know how to be cool. Just being able to point out the behavior and have a conversation with the context of all of their participation can be really constructive. And that's one of the most satisfying things for me as a mod, is to actually help people have better conversations and have a better time where they don't feel like everyone's always against them because their conversational style was hostile. Because people often don't know they're doing it. They're doing what they see. They're doing what Twitter trained them to do. sometimes they just talk like that, but it doesn't come across in text.
Well, I mean, I have that thing myself. I mean, as someone who is neurodivergent, I tend to be a very yes, no type of person, right? So, you know, my friend will talk to me for hours and we'll be like, they will tell me and I will say, oh, interesting. And it comes across as rude. Well, it's definitely not my intent. And so sometimes I think it's interesting because there's a balance that you always try to find, and it's super hard to find, which is sometimes I lean towards not deleting some things because I think it actually allows you as a member to make informed decisions about this person, right? If we do hide everything and do delete everything, you might not know that this person tends to have this kind of behavior, right?
Right.
But sometimes it gets to a point where you not only address it as a warning, but you address it as maybe you're not seeing how this comes across. Have you considered that this is actually being a problem? And a lot of times people actually listen and they are like, oh, good to know. And you see a huge change in behavior.
Yeah, it's funny. So Television Without Pity, may it rest in peace, was legendary for being one of the tightest moderation forums on the internet back in the day. They had an incredibly fine-grained list of things you were and were not allowed to say. No off-topic conversation, even tangentially. I am not envious of those moderators. It must have been rough. But one of the rules that stuck with me was do not start sentences with In text, starting a sentence with ends up sounding condescending. It just does. And I read that when I was like 18 or 19 when I came across that. And I was like, well, that's really, wait, no, that really does make me sound like a dick. Wow, I should stop doing that. Like, even if I didn't mean to, even if it's just a sort of like, I'm thinking of it as a, you know, oh, I just want to bring up this point and I'm a little hesitant about it. It ends up sounding condescending as hell. And so I just stopped doing that. And that actually helped.
And actually, you know, now that I think about it, as someone whose native language is not English, and by the way, I never formally studied English other than in high school, which is super basic, right? So I had to learn it in life.
Right.
And so one of the things is that how you learn is through media, like literally music and stuff like that. Then you get to the internet and video games. And so things that you actually learn from the internet, you don't realize how they come across, right? So things like, well, actually, when you start a sentence, right? Which is terrible. I mean, it's a way to sound like I don't care about what you're saying. That's what I would read, right? So I would see it as common.
Right. And you just pick up those things. It's you know, there's a constant conversation about African-American vernacular English and words from the sliding into internet discourse and then getting used by white people who have no idea of all the connotations from its original source. And mostly people are not trying to, like, they don't know where it came from. No one knows where slang comes from, you know, 90% of the time. And they genuinely don't have any of that knowledge, don't realize they're kind of making fools of themselves. And it's often really helpful to be like, you realize that is not a word in your dialect and you are not using it correctly. Like, that's actually a really nice thing to have people tell me. I try not to use slang I don't feel like I understand, but it's nice when I do and I'm wrong and someone calls me on it, because then I won't do it again.
And yeah, I mean, it's a matter of context, right? Because I mean, historically, one of the things that I actually enjoy, it's like when you watch a TV show from the 90s or early 2000s, right? That then you are like, oh, I used to like this. And then you watch it again and it's impossible to watch. Like, you can't.
Agonizing.
Yeah, because they don't age well. I mean, the discourse in humanity is evolving, which is a nice thing. It's
Yes.
an important thing. And now we have diversity and other voices. And the thing is, as much as that evolves, we all start realizing over time how we don't get to have the last word on if something is right or if something it's hurtful to someone, right? So you have to be willing to listen.
Yeah. You don't get to decide if what you said was hurtful. You don't get to decide if you're intimidating somebody or making someone feel unwelcome. That's not your call.
Yeah.
You get to decide your intentions, but you don't get to decide your effect.
I actually remember one very specific case that happened to me. It was one of the first things that I was like, oh, I've been saying this. Oh, whoa, crap. Which is once it got reported because someone said something like, whatever is my spirit animal. But it was like mac and cheese is my spirit animal.
Right.
And I was looking at the report and immediately I was like, oh,
yeah.
How can I even... I realized something that I had been doing because I mean, at some point in the internet that became a joke, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I get this
immediately.
Yeah, I get this.
If someone's culture becomes a joke, something has to be wrong there.
Right. Like using tribe casually, describing my group of friends as a tribe is something that is starting to get some genuinely well-deserved pushback. And now I think about that, like, that's really not what I mean. That's not like I'm pulling on a bunch of stereotypes and like media images on what societies that live in tribes look like in Hollywood to describe my friend group. It really has nothing to do with any of the cultures that word is correctly used to describe. And so I want to be more precise. I don't want to be sloppy like that. And I don't want to trade on stereotypes like that.
And then there is this pushback that people have, right? Where people see as language evolves and how your expected behavior evolves and changes, then there's a pushback of people saying, why am I not able to say this anymore or stuff like that? And the thing is, I don't think it's a matter of prohibiting someone of saying something. It's if you're going to say something, we want you to be aware of what it actually means and how it actually impacts other people, right?
Yeah. I mean, the point of using words is to communicate. And so knowing more about the words you use makes you communicate better. I don't know why anybody doesn't want to communicate better.
Everyone benefits from that, right? I mean, of course, there's always pushback, but I don't think it's necessarily a problem.
Yeah.
Now, before we get... Go ahead. No, you go.
There is a phenomenon that I could probably find the Ask Me question in which I linked to the resource that I read about it. This is how I MetaFilter stores my entire memory sometimes, where people who want to be aware of social justice issues, but don't really have the background and aren't getting the background from anything other than like social media, and aren't very confident in what they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing. They don't really know enough. They seize on words, specific, you shouldn't say that words, and watch like hawks for them and jump on people for them. And this is less a problem on MetaFilter, honestly, than the general internet, because in MetaFilter, you're genuinely having a conversation. But it is a very incomplete form of social justice. Like, for all that I think we should all know what all those words mean, I think watching the internet for people who to use them and then jumping down their throats is a very bad way of actually improving conditions.
And actually, to me, there is a very interesting thing now that you mentioned that, which is how you cannot separate product from policy. Like the policy you decide will actually decide how the product will end up being used and will look like, and how you design the product will actually define policy as well, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things with MetaFilter at this point is it's a very unique thing, right? Because it's very text-based. That there are no sub-threads. You're literally just one comment here and then it goes down. You can't reply to something specific. And all that, which I actually think I actually enjoy it a lot and I actually like it the way it works.
Yeah.
It also has this thing which is, again, it requires some specific skills, right? Unless, because you cannot, if you write something that that it's misinterpreted, it's not like you can add your tone of voice to that, or you can, even, emojis are not even common, which to me, historically, as someone who's not a native speaker, I rely a lot on stuff like that, like emojis and stuff like that. So, whatever I say that can sound rude, I try to add it with smileys and stuff like that, that it's like, I don't mean it in any harmful way. I just...
Right.
And so it's very nuanced. It's quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, it really is.
Now, talking about that before, let me talk about what we have in store and what we have in the future. Because I think, as we have been covering, MetaFilter has been around for quite a long time. And things have changed several times. In this iteration right now, we do have a lot of things going on. Particularly, I think the biggest things that have happened to MetaFilter is now that we have the steering committee and the BIPOC board, and I'll go into detail about what our work with them is and how things are changing, but then side projects and stuff. I think that now that we do count with a bigger group of support, right? And decisions are being made. And on a technical level, if you look at the latest site update, it had so many things going on now because it's not just one person pushing things through, right?
Right. Yeah,
and
that's
so now that we
fun
have
to watch.
that, and now that we have that changes a lot of things. One of the things that changes is how we are now able to focus a lot more, like literally, for example, I thought it's small, yes, but for example, the fact that we now have an active Twitter account that actually tweets what's happening in MetaFilter, that could not happen in the past because everyone was doing everything. So now that you get to have moderators who are focusing mostly on the content side of things, which is policy, how things are developed, now we're getting to a point where we can start having specific projects for specific things and evaluating policy. Technology is changing. So for example, one of the things that you will actually have, there's a meta talk there will be a meta talk soon about one of the things that we are discussing internally, for example. But what about AI and content generated by AI? What's our policy there, right?
Right.
And it's a thing that it's not our decision to make. So going back to the things that we can't do while we respect other people's privacy, those conversations, I think we now as moderators are in way better shape to actually not only address those things, but have an open discussion about how we want to shape the MetaFilter in the future, how it's going to look like, how these decisions will be made and not made by a few people, but actually by a community together.
Right.
And now we do have for a first time in a while, we do have first bandwidth, right? And then we have the specific people focusing on that. It's not everybody trying to do everything while at the same time you're checking flags and trying to, that thing where you are literally, because one of the things that nobody knows, which this is super important, is there are a couple days and they are very different. You have days when you are just, flags are not coming in and you're just reading through threads that are super active, seeing how things are, and that's super nice. Then there are days where you see the flags come in and you are in a meeting and at the same time an email and someone pinging you, and then you remember you had to do something else. And
there were a lot of those days.
Yeah, and you look at the flags and you are like, sure, I'll get there. Give me just 5 minutes.
Right? Oh yeah, man, there were some days. I mean, the mega threads, the whole couple years of political mega threads, that was the worst idea. That was the worst idea. And I
that
just
I
want to
think
state for the record that I was against it from the start. And if we had listened to me.
And I think that's a good, it's a good way of framing it, because I mean, sometimes the people do understand the pushback as, no, we don't want to have open discussions or conversations, which is, no, actually, we do want to have them in a way that it's sustainable, that does not involve me going out of my shift and at 3 a.m. still being from my phone like, okay, so,
right.
oh. And you spend your night literally thinking how you're going to reply to that as soon as you wake up in the morning.
Yeah,
that's which used to be the case.
Nuts. It very much was, and it was not sustainable. It's not sustainable. It's not healthy, and it does not lead to good decision making.
Yep.
One of the things I've really enjoyed watching with the steering committee is the ability for someone to say to a response that is, we don't have the bandwidth for that, to say, you could volunteer. Do you want to do it? The sign-up sheet's over there. You want to fix this? Go fix it. Like, come on, man, we're busy. Which is something we could never do. We just had to constantly be like, we would like to do that. That's a great idea. And we can't. We just can't. There's just no way. We don't have the resources. And it's really nice to see resources, and actually getting to do things.
And that actually leads us to another thing, which to me, I mean, I would say, here's the thing from a moderation standpoint, because I think organizationally, the fact that we do have the steering committee now, it means a lot of things. First, the site is moving faster than ever. Like, you have no idea how things are getting done, and decisions are being made, and projects are happening. And I am like, wow, this actually feels nice. That on an organizational level, right? As operations, how we get things developed, created, a plan, not for what we're going to do in the next few weeks, but what are we going to do down the road in the next months? What are priorities? Yeah. But when it comes to moderation, I have to give a huge props to the work that the BIPOC board is doing. There was a recent meta thread about what the mandate of the actual BIPOC board is. But this goes back to one thing, which is, as moderators, it's pretentious to claim that you can make decisions and claim to understand the experience of everyone, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's something
it's
that
never
you
gonna
can't
happen.
do.
Yeah.
Right. And so having something like the BIPOC board, to me, first, it has been picking up momentum a lot. But on top of that, how now it's getting to a point where, because in the first meetings, I think it was a lot about seeing where we were at, understanding things. Now it's more getting to a point where conversations we do have, they actually evolve into actual things that we realize, oh, we should probably change the policy on this, right?
Yeah.
We could probably look into how this can be done better. And there have been changes, and there will be. And that allows us to do another thing, which again, it's a matter of resources. I don't think it's always a matter of not having the resources, but how you actually use them in the right way, right? So things like this. So things that are discussed with the BIPOC board, that we get recommendations from them, can then be presented to the community, and will be presented to the community as, so this is where we're coming from. These are the ideas of how policy will be either changed, which can happen, yes, but I think that more than changing policy, a lot of what we will see in the future will be policies created for things that did not exist in the past. The case in point, I was talking about artificial intelligence, right?
Right.
When did MetaFilter have to worry about artificial intelligence in the past, right?
I mean, Markov chains have been a running joke on MetaFilter since its inception, I think, but that was as far as it ever went. And now we're in a totally different world.
Yeah, and we need to adapt to that as much as part of the beauty of the site is how it's very simplified, you know, it's not like this is
Yeah.
not TikTok where it's video and audio
Yeah.
and I no, it gets to
It's
the
just
simplest
text.
part.
Yeah,
It's
it is.
just text. And that being said, that doesn't change the fact that the world is changing and we need to change and
Yeah.
evolve with that.
Yeah. It's something. And it is, the BIPOC board in particular is great because, you know, I have my interests and my various sort of identities and the identities of my friends that I'm exposed to the conversations going on with those people. And that's very much not everybody. And having more people who are in more conversations, who know what's going on right now, what are the issues right now, and how are they bleeding over into everything else for the people in those groups, and also how is the sort of general discourse of the Western world bleeding into MetaFilter. No one person can keep track of that. No 5 people can keep track of that. The more people, the better. The more people with a wider social network, with a wider context, the better. And that's really great. That was really what I hoped the BIPOC board would eventually become, because it started in my last 9 months, but we really didn't get scheduling. Like, we had a couple of meetings, but it was still very tentative and very, very much, I think, the board figuring out if they could trust us. And if it was worth it. And that's that. I'm glad to see they decided it was. That's great.
And I mean, talking from experience, I mean, again, I am not saying that this will happen or can happen. I mean, I'm talking just from my personal experience. One of the things I would like to see in the future is not only have the BIPOC board, but actually have other groups of representation, because there are so many other things. I mean, when it comes to content, perfect example, I mean, age representation. I know that we do have people from a wild variety of ages, right?
Yeah, from teenagers to octogenarians,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that happen is it gets overlooked easily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not if you want or not that you don't have the sensitivity to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I mean, sometimes you just, which is this thing that you have to explain to people, right? It's like, it happens, same that it happens to me when sometimes I'm talking to my grandfather and he is like, oh, but I just said something nice. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not realizing that she has to deal with that 10 times a day.
Right.
At the very least, on a nice day.
Yeah.
So at some point you don't want to hear it. Why is a stranger saying hi?
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we all need to do that, and having more like that, it's actually something I would like to see. I do think that working with the BIPOC board right now, it's helping us get a structure to implement something, to implement more than that, and seeing more of that will allow us to get to another place. So I do think that, I mean, I'm excited because as much as I loved, I mean, I loved the site since I've been, even before I was around, because I've been a lurker for a while.
Right.
But even like that is now the pace at which things are evolving and happening. And before it was like, oh, so many things that could happen if I had 5 minutes, right? But I don't have those 5 minutes. Now it's getting to a point where we are not there yet, but I do think that we will get there.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's not just the raw manpower, person power, word I haven't contemplated in a while. It is that we were burned out. Everybody who worked at MetaFilter through the Trump administration was burned out. Really, really badly.
I can imagine.
Burned out. And there's only so much you can do to fight through that. And we got through that straight into the pandemic. And it just, I mean, it took me a year and a half to be able to think about applying for jobs in my field again. Like, I was fried to a crisp. And I don't think I was the worst. I was just the one who was in a position to get out earlier. And it's really nice to see people who are excited, who can muster excitement because I love the site too, but there was a period of time, I mean, I just didn't read the site for several months after I left because I needed to like grow that part of my soul back. And
you know, actually, I think it's like, I think the wise decisions started being made, at least where I started seeing those changes where we actually started to acknowledge that something had to be done about that.
Yeah.
So for example, I remember after you left the operations part of things, and so Cortex was taking the site updates again. And after a couple of them, I was like, how about you don't do them and I do that myself?
Yeah.
And I think that the community at some point read that as if someone picked me to do it and that wasn't fair. And I was like, no, actually, I want to do this because I can see how being burnt out, and on top of that, having to have all the communications and everything makes it hard, right? So so it only made sense. And from there, we realized that being in a position where you can do what you excel at changes a lot.
It really does. It's really, I really did enjoy the 9 months or so where I was just doing operations. I mean, I like moderating, but I was fried. But even that, I was so burned out. And it really does help. It helps to have a regular update schedule. It helps to have a structure for those things. It really helps to have someone managing it who isn't sensitized to community reactions to the point where it's really hard to filter it. Because that's always one of the tricks of being a community manager. And I have worked, you know, like when I worked in video games, one of my big jobs was to read customer feedback and translate it into something that had fewer cuss words in it so that the developers could read it and take it as constructive feedback and not have to deal with the emotion behind it. And MetaFilter hasn't had that buffer. It hasn't ever really. And I don't know that it really can because of the structure. But now at least there's more people to sort of spread that load around to. Because having to sort of drain off that emotion.
It has slightly changed because sometimes, for example, at least now we are at a point where, I mean, of course, you can't stop anyone from actually checking threads, right?
Right.
But sometimes I do get to see where, while we are in a meeting, I update them on where the discussion is going and what people are saying and stuff like that. And I do realize that they have been not worrying about that thread because that's for me to worry about. You know, of course,
it's such a blessing.
It's a huge difference.
It really is. Because those are the angry threads. Those are the disappointed threads. Those are the upset threads. And you can only swallow so much of that, especially when you can't do anything about it. Because that was the cause of the burnout. It was that kind of, what is that? Moral injury is, I think, the term, where you're put in a position where you can't do the right thing. And, you know, it's a very minor kind of moral injury, but being in that position for years where we know there's a right thing to do and we can't do it, and we have to deal with that, we have to have that in our faces every single day, is just exhausting.
And then there's a thing that I think when it comes to, because here's the thing, I mean, sometimes people fail to, I think people fail to see that if you have huge emotional reactions to something, is because you care, right? I mean, to me, it's obvious, but sometimes people don't get it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, if it's like, I don't think if you get, and I'm gonna say names, right? But I mean, I don't think for someone who's working on trust and safety for Facebook, that any of those people, when they see something in the site, I don't think they care. They either remove it or not, and that's it, right?
Right.
Because I mean, it's a entirely different type of industry.
Completely different kind of job.
Yeah, it's an entirely different thing, right? Well, here you are actually invested in everything, right?
Yeah.
You do care.
Yeah.
And there's no way around it. It's just the way it works. I mean, even if you were to,
there's I mean, the unique thing about MetaFilter that I say to people when people who don't know it and I'm talking about my work is that on MetaFilter, the product is the community. Most community jobs, you are running community in order to sell a product, whether that product is ad space, a la Twitter, or, you know, when I was working in games, the product was a video game and we ran a community because that's a very good way to keep people playing your game. And so all of the policy decisions were geared towards selling more product. MetaFilter, the product is the community. They're not, it always has been, even when we were making most of our money with ad space, we were not actively selling ads. We had Google ads and that was it. Google handled that. None of us gave a lick of thought to it. And that was probably not a good thing in the long run.
Which is interesting because when people, I mean, for someone who doesn't come from the industry background, right? Hearing something like the product is the community sounds like very cold, but actually it's the other way around.
Yeah.
Which actually that translates into why we are now trying to have a site that it's mostly run by the community as well.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, because that's the point. There is no other point. And the point was never to make money. I mean, the point was to keep roofs over all the heads of the moderators because we got bills and cats. But you know, the point was never to sell the site for $1 billion. Matt had a couple of points where he could have, and he was very firmly against it. And no one else who's run the site has ever wanted to sell the site for $1 billion. I mean, it's gotten to the point where passing ownership around of the site is kind of a hot potato. Like somebody got to hold it, but you better have your gloves on.
And probably at some point during one day I'll probably talk about that because I've been through several. I mean, I've been through communities that have gone, you know, they have actually gone public and they have sold the actual community, and those are things where I mean, I can go on for hours on how emotional I am about those things and how the product changes forever and it's no longer something that the community controls.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think this is a good closure.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see if we've got questions.
So that we can open it up for Q&A. So for anyone, if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand in Zoom or type them in the comment section and we can start addressing questions. We're here for you.
Yeah. Let's see. All right. And we might not have any questions, in which case we can just keep nattering on about community, because I know we can both do that for many more hours if encouraged.
So while we wait for questions to come, if we have any, Aylin, how much time do you think we have left?
We have quite a lot of time, and because this is the last session of the night, really feel free to go on for as long as you would like.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think maybe one thing I could ask that I kind of know the answer to, but just for the benefit of the people watching or tuning in later, maybe you could talk a bit more. You were talking about mod burnout, right? So, and you were talking about having a buffer. So it seems better to have maybe a designated admin role or people who are not intimately involved in the moderation, whose purpose as staff is there specifically maybe to communicate more factual things to the community or to just do admin or managerial work, right? More about the nuts and bolts of the operation kind of thing. So what do you think about that? And what are some of the developments going in either way in that sense?
Well, I can talk about the history a little bit. I mean, originally it was Matt's site. He owned it. He made all the decisions ultimately. You know, he definitely solicited feedback from the community and from the staff, but you know, he was where the buck stops. And he burned out on it. He talked about it. I mean, there's a thread about it. I'm not spilling his personal details here. And he first left management of the site to Josh, and then he eventually passed on ownership of the site. And Josh had a much more collaborative style in terms of policy decisions and stuff. But the way everything had been set up, everything from managing the ads to managing the taxes to keeping track of the money and a lot of the like fiddly tech stuff and a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't even realize he was doing until he joked about it in some random MetaTalk thread. Matt had been doing all of that, so Josh was doing all of that. And so the last couple of years was a process of divestment of saying, hey, buddy, we can split some of that out. We can break out some of those pieces and give them to other people. But the way the business was arranged made it really difficult. And it sounds like now that has been atomized even further so that it's not all on one person who also has a full-time job.
And on that, I can address a couple things because I mean, I get to see it. I've been through different stages, right? I get to see it as an outsider, and then I get to see the process on other people, and then I had to see what can I do and how can I do it, because otherwise I will probably burn out myself as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so let me think through that for a second. So there were things that I will take it with one example. I will take it with the site updates, which I think to me, it's a perfect example because it's publicly, you can tell there has been a huge difference on how historically it used to be done and how I started doing it, which was my communication style is, to say the very least, is way drier. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm a person of very few words when it comes to writing. Mm-hmm. And there were two reasons for that, right? One is that first, it's part of my nature. That doesn't mean that I don't have a ton of ideas. Now, when you get me to talk on a video, you're seeing the difference, right? But when it comes to writing, I am like, yeah, I mean, this is either yes or no, and here's why, period, mm-hmm. right? And so I think that helped in a way because that made communication easier to, we stay within the subject as much as we can. Sometimes, of course, it's going to explode because it's a community with people with different concerns and different questions and different backgrounds. So, of course, mm-hmm. that can change anytime. But I do think that the communication style and the fact that there were right off the bat, because before it was like, even if it would be posted by Josh or by Restless or anyone, mm-hmm. all of us would be on top of the thread, right? Which meant 24/7 attention. So when it changed to be just one person, it also came with clear boundaries on, well, this person, which was me at the time, I was like, well, I will, if it takes a couple days for me to get back to you, it's seriously not because I don't care. It takes a couple days because that's how long it's taken me to get there, which I don't think before those expectations were there.
No, they really weren't.
And so one of the things, go, please.
No. Please continue.
No, what I was trying to say is that, for example, one of the things that I've been trying to do the best I can with that is for the moderators who have been here for a long time. They actually are great moderators and they do a great job, right? But when it comes to communications within threads and stuff like that, it can get draining quite easily. Or when it comes to issues. So, for example, when we have clearly defined escalation paths now, which I would say, which is like, if someone, for super obvious reasons, they get banned or something like that, right? And then we address why this happened. And they can get super abusive, right? And mm-hmm. so immediately it's one of those things where I am like, you don't have to deal with that. Just pass it on to me and I'll take care of it, right? Because I can repeat 10,000 times the same thing, which is, no, you did violate everything. We are not even negotiating. Yeah. Right. And so I think it's better because just the fact that I am stepping in fresh in the discussion, right?
Yeah. just trading off is often really helpful.
Exactly,
and,
which
yeah, the site update thing is interesting because it used to be like an annual state of the site back in the day. And then that really wasn't helpful. And really when the finances started to change, we started to do more updates because people cared. They wanted to know, is the site going to stick around? Do we have enough money to keep the lights on? And so we started, over the course of a couple of years, a variety of different attempts to figure out how to make financial updates work. And those invariably got tied in with every other kind of state of the site, all the tech stuff, all the policy stuff. And so we tried to move to quarterly, and that kind of didn't happen, still was sort of mostly annual. And it just became a huge, like the longer the interval, the bigger the thread, the more pent up response there was in the community. And the sort of shaggier the thread, like there's too many topics. And so it really can't stay on any one and just picks up weird momentum. And so, yeah, one of the things that I did when I took over was like, okay, I'm posting every Friday. I'm just posting every Friday with what happened this week. And that was probably more than was strictly necessary, but it was a deliberate overcorrection so that people could, because to start that process of setting expectations that there's going to be one thread with one person watching that happens regularly that you can count on. And that didn't keep up regularly once I stepped back again. And so it was really nice to see that stabilize again, because I think it really does help. It's just helpful to know, to have reasonable expectations, to have like, okay, I know we're going to get a site update. I know about when it's going to happen. I know about what it's going to contain. And just chills everyone out.
And I think is, because then there's another thing, which is how you assume and how you understand where people is coming from, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, when there have been a lot of conversations about transparency and things, and the thing is, I think that people sometimes interprets that there's something that we're hiding or something like that. Well, sometimes it's a perfect example is now with the fundraising, right? It's like, mm-hmm. we haven't had an update in a few weeks. And the reason it's numbers get tricky. We don't want to give you wrong numbers, right? We are going to look through the data as thoroughly as we can. And that might take a while. And the thing is, I think it sometimes is okay to say, look, the answer is yes, we will do this, but this will take a while. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Which is as honest as you can be. I think that has changed also in the site culture, which is like we have been like more willing to be openly say yes, but I mean, you'll have to wait.
Well, and you've also done a very good job of building some community trust so that when you say this is taking longer than we expected, it will come out in a little while, people believe you. There was a long period where people just didn't believe us if we said something wasn't going to happen, like something was going to happen eventually. They'd just be like, well, that means never. And it was kind of true. And now it's not.
Yeah.
You were raising it. Yes.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, when people talk about transparency and accountability, I mean, that can encompass a very broad range of things. So for example, like what you said about the financial update, that is, in a way, it's more straightforward, right? Because the numbers are taking time. We don't have the robust accounting system we would like to have to be able to give updates as soon as we would like. But for other issues, right, I think people have talked about this in the past, and I know, BIPOC board have had conversations with the mods about this as well. Like things like content deletions, things like even mods making questionable decisions and saying certain things that upset certain users in threads, right? And then having their comments being deleted, and then people coming into the threads later on and going, what happened? Like, why, what happened? And what did that mod say that was so offensive? that people are now arguing about that is now gone. Like, and then they say there's no, like, where's the accountability? Where is the record that we can examine for ourselves instead of having to rely on this hearsay? And I think that in itself can be pretty poisonous, right? Because then when people don't know something, they start to speculate because they don't have the information on hand. So I think that's also another area of accountability that maybe we could look into. And like, I'm interested to see what you would have to say on that.
Well, on that, I actually think that you're bringing something super important, which is the BIPOC board. And I'm going to explain why. Because I think that when it comes to course correction or to improvement, right, it's very hard to do it when it comes from the same group that, not intentionally, but, you know, when the same group of people, when something starts not going in the best way, probably it's not something intentional. It's just something that happens as things pile up, right? So having some people come in from the outside to actually have you go through that in a way that it's, rather than accusatory or anything, just like, let's review this, why this happened, why we can change it in the future, which I think it's the biggest value of the BIPOC board, which allows us to see things. To me, it's actually weird sometimes, because then there is a thing that right, sometimes I am like, oh, I am looking at things that happened, I don't know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, that even sometimes I need to go back to ask people, like, can you fill me in a little bit? Because otherwise this will be me reading for like 6 hours at the very least.
There's a lot of history here.
Which is not to say the fact that I haven't been there for the whole thing doesn't make it as important anymore. No, if this is important to people, I do need to understand where it comes from, and I do need to listen to what can be done. How do you correct it? And I do think that having a structure for that, it's the best thing ever. Because if we don't have a structure, it's us trying to just guess. Please go ahead, Ayala.
Yeah, so I get that we are trying to, and I'm part of the BIPOC board as well, so I know we've had this conversation before, but I think just for the benefit of, you know, people watching, like, what is being done now in terms of accountability in the area that I mentioned, in terms of, you know, making discussions be a bit more transparent and making it so that people at least have some record of what was being said when these contentious threads come up. And what is the policy now towards all these deletions and stuff? Like, are mods still able to say certain things in thread and have their comments be deleted and people not know what's going on? Like, what is the policy moving forward? Yeah.
Sure. So on that first thing, the main thing that we are doing right now is case studies, which is where right now there's a combination of previous threads, right? Like years old. And there have been cases of recent cases where something happens, and I will try, without violating any privacy, to go into details of how decisions were made, right? And a lot of that allows us to actually realize where, yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing right now. Thank you. And so that has allowed us to collect from the BIPOC board specific feedback. There have been cases where once we explain why something happened, we are actually, the BIPOC board will issue a recommendation directly where it's like, well, that shouldn't have happened. And then we are able to address it as a team with the moderation. So that has been so far. I would say, though, that it's at a stage where it still needs to evolve, and we need more of that. So I think a lot of work is coming. Other than that, it also evolves into actual policy, right? Which somehow, here's the thing that I will say is, and Restless, you probably have a lot more opinions than I have on this, and a lot more experience on this, right? But then there is a huge complicated thing about the balance, because I mean, most of the moderators are also members, and when are you a member and where are you a moderator on a thread, it's a thing where I do think that if you look at other organizations, right, they do have super clear policies that can be super extreme. While with MetaFilter, I think that has been a little bit more up in the air. And I think that in the long run, as we move forward, there have to be clearer policies on how that works and how we do that precisely for the well-being of the community.
So historically, the way that we would have handled this before the MetaTalk queue, that was really the point at which it changed, is somebody would start a MetaTalk and say, what the hell happened there? And we'd say, well, this is what happened, and often repost the comment so that people could have the conversation about what happened in that thread in MetaTalk. That was originally what MetaTalk was for. We didn't implement the queue to stop that. The fact that it stopped is actually, I think, kind of the worst outcome. Like, we needed the queue for a variety of reasons at the time, because the way MetaTalk sucked resources was unsustainable. It was untenable. There was no way for the staff we had to moderate the site and run often multiple contentious MetaTalk threads at the same time. Wasn't working. So we implemented the queue so that we could space them out, so that we could always have somebody who had enough bandwidth to actually read the thing, because they don't do any good if we're not reading them when they're, policy discussions or criticisms of moderators. But what happened is people stopped making those threads. They stopped going to MetaTalk and saying, hey, this thread went weird. Let's talk about it. Because that used to be a staple. And at this point, I wouldn't go back. I don't think going back to that is a good plan. I think those threads were often, in the same way that call-out threads of users were often kind of toxic, call-out threads of moderators were often kind of toxic. I know I had my first one about a month into my tenure here, and somebody quoted Latin at me and overran the character limit for the title, and totally misunderstood the actual moderation exchange. And the person who got moderated wasn't mad about it, but this other person decided to make a thing of it. And it was a threat. I mean, it's there. You can look it up. I believe the search term would be juvenile, as in the Roman orator. But like, there was another one not long after Tez started where somebody insulted her mother. Like, they got bad. They got really comically bad. So I wouldn't go back to that. But I do think that is a feedback loop that we kind of lost in the last 6 years or whatever.
And why do you think that was lost?
I think those threads were usually made on impulse. I think people would basically just wanted to go, what the hell? And when they could do that with 3 clicks, they did. And then as soon as it wasn't 3 clicks, they didn't feel able to. They didn't feel like we'd approve it, or it just wasn't easy. A whole bunch of, we just got really different MetaTalk threads after we implemented the queue, and it was a little bit of a surprise because we didn't not post MetaTalk threads. There was never a period where we were mostly not posting them, or even not posting very many. There were always a couple where we were like, I don't think we want to set you up to be screamed at by the community for 4 days, because that is going to suck for everyone. And if you can't rephrase that, I think we're going to have to pass. And it helped with somebody was like, I can't find the post button. We could just email them and reply and not waste everyone else's time. But we didn't not post MetaTalks. They just stopped getting made.
And I can give some context on how it happens right now as well, because I mean, while it's not all the time, there are weeks when it gets busy, right? When you get to realize that there are enough posts in the queue that you need to space them out, because otherwise, I mean, people will not have enough time to have these conversations. One of the reasons why, for example, we stopped having the site updates while we were having the fundraising, it's exactly that, because it's ongoing conversations all the time and people get tired of trying to keep track of all of them. And so it happened in the past, it has happened in the past few months that when it gets busy, so sometimes I write to some of them and I am like, are you okay with waiting a couple days because these conversations are going? And in the meantime, while you wait, I can tell you that this is what it's been done, what we've been doing about this, right? And a lot of times the answer is like, oh, actually, if that was the answer, that's everything I need. Thank you. Actually, no need to post it.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys are aware of that, or if, I don't know, Jessamine already knows that this is a thing, or if you are aware that this is a feature that we want, or that this, something has to happen with this, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
It has happened several times in the past months. Go ahead.
Yeah, wait, so just to confirm, when was the queue implemented?
I would have to look it up exactly, but I know it was after one of the staffing reductions. I don't remember. There was a period of time where it was me, Josh, and Lobster Mitten working 6-day weeks with a 7-day week every third week. It was bad. We did not have enough staff. That was bad. And Taz overnight. Taz and Nifty were overnights, but the daytime was just the three of us. And it was not enough to do 24/7 coverage, which we were still trying to do. And it was definitely implemented by the time we got to that point. I don't remember if it was implemented before when we had like one more person. But it ended up being, I mean, it took a long time for me to realize that there was a big change, because mostly it was just a matter of, hey, we're really lightly covered over the weekends. Can we hold this till Monday? Or we have another one going right now. Can we let that one die down for a day or two? It took a long time for me to realize that as a feedback mechanism, it had really changed, because that was not our intention, nor was the implementation something that I would have expected to do that, but it did.
Mm-hmm. Was this, I guess, I'm wondering, was this before 2019?
Probably.
Okay.
I could look it up. Let me look it up. I'm on a computer.
Cool.
I can
Sure,
find this.
Yeah. Because I think coming at this sort of being a member longer than I've been able to sort of see behind the curtain, so to speak, I did find these MetaTalk threads, some of them, not all of them, very useful in the way that, you know, someone would say there's something wrong with this, the way this thread is going or the way it's being moderated, and I feel that the moderators aren't seeing this or addressing this. And then they would bring it to MetaTalk, and then people would start discussing it. And it wasn't, I don't think the outcomes were all bad. Like, honestly, I would say the BIPOC board was born out of these threads in MetaTalk. I don't think the board would actually be around if not for all that hard work that went into these community threads that you could call maybe call out threads, right? Outrage filter. That was a huge thing. I think that kind of snowballed a lot of things. And that was born out of someone questioning, why did the mods decide to do this, you know, for a certain thread? So yeah. There is, I see both sides. So I'm wondering, how would you distinguish, how would you sort of find the middle ground, right? In allowing threads that would be conducive to pass and threads that maybe would be more of a burden on your mental health than anything to,
So just, I looked it up. This happened in 2014, so quite a while ago. And one of the things that has happened since is we also sort of turned up the moderation on MetaTalk. It used to be almost completely unmoderated, unless it was like an active slur or like something pretty nuclear grade. We did not moderate MetaTalk. That was the policy for a long time. It was not a functional policy. It made MetaTalk threads much higher heat and much lower light than they needed to be. They were not constructive. People got mad at each other. They yelled and screamed until somebody quit. It was a bad scene. It's not that nothing good came out of them, but it was just being like, no, the rules of discourse still apply here. You cannot insult Taz's mother. You have to find a way to have this conversation like we're all people with equal worth. And that happened, I think, after the key went into effect. It was a very gradual process. And I think it is different now. I think those threads go differently now. On the other hand, it is, so there was a thread. This is all very public, so, I'm not spilling any secrets, but there was a thread. Eyebrows said something intemperate about something relating to child death. There was somebody made a joke. She was upset about it. She said something moderately intemperate. Turned out about half the community was also really upset about it. And then a bunch of the community thought that she shouldn't have said that. And what ended up happening, there's a call out thread. There were two, as a matter of fact. I think one of them was for policy and one of them was just for yelling. But what happened is Eyebrows said, I just had a personal tragedy. I need to not be reading this thread right now. And we shuffled shifts around and she took the weekend off so she could go deal with her personal life, which was really, part of what was going on there. And someone else could read that thread and talk about how, what needed to happen. Sometimes, like, a lot of it was just venting. A lot of it was people going, oh, I didn't think that joke was offensive, but it's clearly offensive. A lot of people are really mad about it, and just as mad as Eyebrows was. But I also think it was really right for her not to be the one to read that thread. Like, she needed to not have to deal with a fire hose of people yelling at her in the moment when everybody's emotions are really high. That is not a constructive way to change behavior. And having the rest of the team handle that thread and come back and we could talk about it, process it, pull some of that heat out of it, and figure out what needed to happen, was really constructive. And it sounds like that's what the BIPOC board is doing now, is being that group of going, okay, we're going to think through this. We're going to present it in a format that is not 300 angry people all yelling the same thing at once.
And on that, sorry to interrupt you, but I think there's something huge there, which I've seen even when a MetaTalk gets busy right now. One of the things that I'm seeing more and more all the time, given how, this is an organization that has been around for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I get to see more and more is that before it used to be like, I used to see people were having like this opinion and you could have people on this or that side, right? Mm-hmm. Now it's a lot more complex. I'm seeing people who they agree on this specific things and then they disagree on others, and then having an open thread, right, where everybody is commenting at the same time. Sometimes you realize that the mix of coming from hundreds of people, right? Mm-hmm. It gets to a point where it's actually hard, and it's even hard to follow, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. People also get into this loop in MetaTalk threads, less about callouts, but more about policy, where somebody will state a position. Somebody will say, I think I should do thing A. Somebody else says, no, I think we should do thing B. And then a group, like two groups of people will form and behave as though in order to get what they want, they have to convince the other group. And that isn't helpful. That's not the point. It's not a cage match. Nobody wins. We want people to talk about why they want this thing, talk about what they think the implementation should look like. They can present different options, but no one user has to convince one other user to their side to win and get what they want. That's just not how the decision-making process works at all. And call-out threads actually would go the same way. It would be, offense and defense. And people would just scream at each other. And
I think this actually goes back to the beginning of the conversation we were having about how moderation, it's a never-ending thing, right? You never get to the point where you know, like, here's the sweet spot, here's how you should do it. Because, for example, I have, as a moderator, I have this tendency when it comes to MetaTalk where at some point when a thread is going on forever, we start getting flags from people saying, just close it already. This is going in circles, right? And so there are people who agree with that. And I am the one who tends to be a lot like, let's give it some extra time. As long as people feel the need to express their frustration or have something to say, I will allow it for longer, right? I realize that probably I lean a lot more towards just let it be for a while. And some other people are more like, well, actually, yes, it's getting to a point where it's actually a loop, yes.
Yeah, that's often the end of MetaTalk threads. They end in a little loop.
and very honestly, I think very honestly, what I can say is I do think that this is one of those cases where there is no perfect answer to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I have another question, because I think what I'm also getting from all these conversations is that mods really need to be supported, so that they don't burn out, and so that they are also able to make wiser decisions as to which threads they can handle and which threads they're not able to, in some sense. So I think people have been suggesting all kinds of things, right, in terms of how MetaFilter could be dealing with moderation, from AI moderation to volunteer mods, So what do you think about that? I think in particular, the idea that maybe we could scale back on the 24/7 moderation idea, and then people have been saying, well, maybe to cut down on expenses, why not have a team of volunteer mods also filling in? Why should we be paying people to, to be paid professionals, to be moderators, that we're paying instead of having a volunteer team? So maybe could you speak to that?
At length and with great heat if you want. But Lou, why don't you take this first?
Sure. I actually think, okay, so I have two thoughts on that. The first thought being, I would say, here's the thing. When it comes to moderation, it's one of the things that I used to say at a previous position with moderation somewhere else. And the thing is, it takes a certain type of person for that, right? It's one of those things that... Sorry, I'm reading the comments and I'm laughing. You can read them. But here's the thing. It takes a certain type of people to get to do it. So it's not like, I would say the resources, people who can do trust, safety, moderation, content, and stuff like that, it's more limited than what you think, because it's not evaluating like this, should this go away or not? Yes, right? I mean, and it's by design, it's emotionally hard. Actually, going back to that, let me actually give you some background. One of my first jobs when I was a teenager, I was like 19, was reviewing abuse for MSN groups, which in most cases was like definitely not MetaFilter kind of thing. I was like 19, and my job was like, I was working at 3 a.m. and it was reviewing and blocking people for child pornography and stuff like that. It took like 2 weeks for me to say, either you change me to do something else for a while, or I'm gonna quit. You don't have the strength to deal with that. Like, you have no idea, right? And so, of course, I'm not trying to equate this to moderating at MetaFilter, which this is an entirely different thing, but I mean, it's hard. And it's hard. What I'm saying is, I don't think it's that easy as just open it up for volunteers to do it. That would be the first thing I would say. And now I think Restless can go on Google.
Yeah, so the answer to AI moderation is no. It's just no. The moderation should never be made. The moderation decision should never be made by a computer. We're not there yet. It's so contextual that you just can't do it. I worked at one job that we used contract moderators for, not the forum I worked on, but one of the other game forums. because it was bigger, and we contracted with a company in India. And those guys were great. They tried really hard. They generally did a good job. American gamer slang completely escaped them, and that meant that they mostly did a bad job. They really wanted to do a good job. They did not have the tools. They just didn't have the language base to understand specifically extremely colloquial English in a way that made sense so that they could make sensible moderation decisions. And those are people. Those are professional, intelligent people who didn't have the tools to do it. It's not even getting into the emotional side of things, which is significant. So AI moderation, yeah. Volunteer moderation is tricky. There's a great comment by, I'd have to look it up, there's somebody on MetaFilter, maybe local Roger, who said, if your admins aren't working for money, you have to deal with whatever their motivation is. Those can vary. They're not always in line with the motivations of the rest of the community. They're not always in line with the motivations of the site. Managing volunteer moderators is a tremendous amount of work. The burnout rate is super high. Most people can't do this job. Most people cannot spend 8 hours a day reading high emotional content stuff without frying their nerves. Also, it's really hard to structure legally for a business that's not a nonprofit. EA got sued over this. You cannot have volunteers doing work you also pay people to do. It's tricky. Like legally, it's tricky. The proposal I posted a couple of weeks ago in one of the threads talking about this was basically to give people more moderation power over their own threads. Simple frontline moderation, which could pull out. The thing that you lose by not having 24 moderation is when somebody posts something genuinely heinous and it stays on the site for 6 hours. That used to happen back in the day when all of the mods were in the US on essentially the same time zone and they had to sleep. Sometimes we'd wake up on a Sunday morning and there'd be something appalling in the queue. That's why we ended up hiring Taz and then later Nifty. If people have the basic power to delete a comment in their own threads, that gets handled a lot more reliably. It's still if I were going to actually present that proposal, that would be probably months of actual speccing out and trial runs and really careful discussion about what kinds of powers everybody would have. And it would be a different site. Professional moderation is one of the services MetaFilter offers that almost no one else offers.
Sorry, there's a question right there in the saying, are there any other sites out there that you think handle moderation of at least MetaFilter scale well? I have a couple things to say on that, because actually I think, so here's the thing, if you ask any community, rarely you will find a community who will say, yes, the moderation is great, and here's the reason why. The reason why it's actually people who are fine with the moderation work probably will not have anything to say, right? The ones who have something to say are the ones who have problems with that, right? And you never get the background on what. I do know some sites, and what I've been seeing, and not only sites, but also apps and stuff like that. From the ones I've been seeing, I've seen two things, which is, and what I'm going to say, it's going to be highly, I mean, people, I'll see reactions, I guess. But going back to Twitter a long time ago, I'm saying what, 15, 12 years ago, something like that.
Sure.
Their approach to content moderation as they were growing was entirely different, and I think it was on the right path. Then it got to the point where, competing priorities, how they handle things, and it gets to be terrible to a whole nother level. On a smaller scales, what I've seen that does good, it's a good mix between having dedicated people who are actually compensated for that and then that you have on a technical level the right tools. So for example, which is one of the things that I've been proposing for a while, which, you know, takes some tweaking and stuff like that. But for example, I do think that not everyone should have the same weight on their flags, right? I mean, as time happens, I think that there's some accuracy that happens on when someone is reporting something. It should be treated differently just because they demonstrate over time that they are. And you know, there are algorithms that are applied like that. So for example, I know of sites that for some things can be deleted automatically even before an actual moderator looks at. And it depends on how members get different voting weight of that. There's a threshold. And how the threshold is reached is how you define accuracy in the reports, right?
For sure.
And so I do think that on a technical level, there are many things that can be done. But in most cases, what I've seen is definitely you need people who care about it, right? It's not something that you can like have a contact center of people who are, you know, it's not the same for. And 1 second to read the other comment.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Maybe you can
actually one. Yes, I have definitely. Actually, if Restless, if you can read it, because you have a way better pronunciation, and I'm a terrible person when I read.
This is Rami saying, I've definitely noticed this both for MetaFilter and other sites. Discussion of a community on other platforms tends to be negative, even for opposite reasons, just because the critics have more reason to be vocal elsewhere and make a negative feedback loop. I think that's absolutely true. And yeah, in terms of like some tools, like, yeah, I think MetaFilter, unless something's drastically changed in the past couple of years, you could absolutely set a tool that if something has 10 flags in, you know, a fixed period of time, you could just delete it and have somebody review it when they get around to it, because that almost never happens. And when it does, it's either obvious spam or absolutely hideous. It's just, there's some things where everybody's like, everybody flags it. The other category is ask posts on the Blue. Those will get 30 flags. Like they'll get 10 flags a minute until something gets deleted. So yeah, I think there is definitely some automation. But you can't automate judgment. And so much of it is judgment.
And you cannot automate in any way the human component. This brings me back to one great example of that, which is, so there is this thing about how AI has been used to interpret X-rays and stuff like that. Right now, you even have apps that by taking a photo from your phone of your skin, it can help you determine if you have skin cancer or not with better accuracy than general doctors, right? And I mean, it's not perfect. There are failures because of the way AI works and stuff like that. And the thing with stuff like that at the end of the day, because that's in the health industry, which is the example I'm picking, is it gets to a point where doctors start wondering, am I going to lose my job, right? I am actually being pushed out. And actually, no, I think it gets to a point, technology gets to a point where it can cover so many things, right? And what it will always leave there, it's a human component, right? So what does it mean? That if you no longer have a doctor filing reports and reading through X-rays all the time and interpreting data, that can be, to a certain degree, it can start and will start being automatized. That's pretty much an unavoidable future. It gets to the point where your healthcare providers, that's the part where you cannot replace a human component, right? How do you have a human that can actually give you advice and be there for your actual human needs, right? You cannot automate that part.
Yeah.
So I think with moderation, it gets to the point that what you can actually automate and what you can actually have done from the tech point of view, it's already at a very limited, there's very little room for that, given how at this point is really, really the core of it. It's how you implement the human component.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about what MetaFilter moderation is, if you look at that list, almost none of that can be automated. You can't automate a conversation with a user talking about what they need to do better.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so, okay, I think I've established, correct me if I'm wrong, feel free to jump in anytime, that, moderation is a way more specialized skill set than a lot of people think, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you need that human component, definitely. So it's not something that, you can entirely automate. And then on the volunteer side, when people are asking, why don't we just outsource all of this to volunteers? It seems, firstly, there's a sort of legal or compliance component, right? Where you can't have some people being paid for a certain task and other people not being paid for that task. So you either make everyone all volunteers or everyone paid mods, right?
Yeah.
So, and the thing is, when you have to choose between those two options, then it gets into, well, we need continuity, we need institutional knowledge. This is a specialized skill set that sort of builds on itself. And you can't just have like a 6-month volunteer term or rotating cast of volunteers stepping in to moderate. And that is really what makes MetaFilter's quality of discussion and moderation so special and in a way so exceptional, right? That's the value proposition, the value add of MetaFilter.
It really is. And the other component that we didn't bring up is privacy. If you're pulling volunteers out of the community, they can see a lot of stuff that I think people don't necessarily want anybody who feels like volunteering to see. They don't necessarily want, there would have to be, it would be a nightmare. It would be a privacy nightmare. And I think there would be a lot of pushback once people really thought through what that meant.
One of the things that you need to think through that Restless mentioned it briefly, but you have no idea how big that is the amount of resources it takes to moderate and the amount of resources it takes to manage volunteers. It's not widely different, right? So it gets just more complex, right? As because there are things that you need to do and you increase the variable. So let's say that you can't have volunteers doing 40 hours a week jobs. Like, you will not have people to agree with that because they have to an actual job that they have to provide for themselves, right?
Yes.
And so you start what you can get by staff accomplished by 6 people, you will need at least 12 when it comes to volunteers, which adds variables when it comes to consistency. So I think it gets to a point where management training the entire thing, and then it's not as consistent or cohesive at the end of the day.
Yeah. Training would be a nightmare too.
Yeah. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with you in the sense that it seems like a lot of people who propose this idea of volunteer mods or alternatives to the moderation setup we have right now, they're thinking foremost in their mind, right, is how can we cut expenses? How can we cut costs, right? So they're thinking, let's try to save like 20K a month in what we're paying to the staff. And then I think they're also failing to see that you still have to, even if it's volunteer, right, this is still labor. And if we're cutting costs where MetaFilter best excels at, right? That's not a very smart business decision, just from a business standpoint. So maybe the answer is really, how do we make more money to support the mods, right? How do we make more money to support the sites? How do we grow instead of trying to starve ourselves, right, of resources? So maybe that's something to think about. And I think part of this, part of why people keep asking these questions is maybe they also want to understand, what do mods do? Like, what are we paying mods to do every day for? So maybe.
And I think I know why that question happens all the time. Honestly, I would guess the reason why it's because they care. I mean, they care about the site, they care about the site finances and the future of the site. And I mean, it's you've seen the site declining in membership activity content for a while, right? So you do care, and that's hard questions need to be asked. I myself have asked myself, should we consider that? And the reason why the way I see it, actually, yes, you just mentioned it. It's like, why would you kill one of the things that actually keeps the site what it is, right?
Yeah, because otherwise it's
that's
just a
actually,
forum.
Yeah.
Like anybody can spin up a forum. That's easy. There's lots of free software. It's a lot of software that works better. Software made more recently than 1999.
And that goes back to the actual title of the presentation, which is what is path forward? And the path forward is definitely not only improving how moderation works, right? But there are 101 ways to make this more sustainable, which we have been playing around with, right? Like, for example, now we have realized that around the clock 24/7 moderation, it's not necessarily, as long as the gaps are not big and we have ways in which we can act on things, even if you're not around the clock, right? Yeah. So we have been finding things that actually work. And I do think more of that, as we have now the steering committee and stuff like that, that is allowing us to have like the momentum for growth in how much can be achieved and how optimized it can be. While it looked dark a few months ago, to me right now actually doesn't look brighter. I mean, the fact that I can't stress enough, like Restless, no matter when she decided to step in and help with the operational things, it helped turn things around. Now that we have the steering committee and we have Jessamine as well, like you have no idea how many days, like there is this thing that I'm gonna say openly, which was like Jessamine was like, yeah, I'll step in and I'll just, it's just gonna be paying taxes and file paperwork once a year and that's it. Hasn't been like that, right? We get to talk pretty much every single day, and I am like, I know.
It was never going to be like that. Jessamine and I had that conversation because Josh asked me if I wanted the site. Yeah, he asked me if I wanted to be the owner, and I said no. I need to have a full-time job. I know this is going to be way more work. And Jessamine has a different lifestyle than I do, and and she loves the site very much, and I'm very happy she did it. But it was never going to be just filing taxes.
Yeah,
and the thing is, like, it has been incredible to watch this fundraiser. That 9 months where I was in charge, we did a fundraiser. We did honestly a kind of smaller scale version of this. We had have Jessamine write a post thing. We had a couple of events. We ended up doing one like Zoom holiday party. It was super fun. That was what I could do on the number of hours the site could afford to pay me, which was not full time. I was working about 10 hours a week in that period. And the fact that you guys have put together an enormous fundraiser with an auction and an entire slate of events over the course of a month is unbelievable. And that's the sort of stuff that volunteers are fantastic for. It's the kind of stuff where you can pull in a whole bunch of people and everybody can contribute their bit and make something huge and great. Whereas moderation is just grinding shift work. I mean, I love it. It's my career, but it is just shift work. You just have to show up and do the job and use your judgment all day, every day, consistently with a consistent team of people. It doesn't translate well to volunteer stuff, but coding, if we can make that work, great. Fundraising, yeah, fundraising is great for volunteer stuff. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff that volunteers can do.
Marketing, copywriting,
marketing, yes, possibly even like web design stuff like that. I still want a splash page, guys. I've been trying to get a splash page going for like 8 years now. Make me a splash page, please.
Okay. Okay, I think we're getting a point where we have covered enough times. We've been for like 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah.
This is a sweet spot where we have taken many things. One of the things that I want to close with is, and I mean, I'm not trying to say nice words, but a part of what I think was important was what is the path forward for moderation. And I think part of what the path forward is, both Jessamine and I agree. The entire moderation team agree that the future of MetaFilter is pretty much a lot more member run, and how that will take shape depends on everyone, right? That changes everything. That changes how moderation will work, how the processes to actually evaluate everything and how decisions are made. All of that is changing. And so what the future is, I think this will be a lot more of an open process and less of a black box on how things happen, which I think it's healthy for the future, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really fun to watch.